Good morning. I think it's about time we begin. Yeah, maybe. We're going to kind of pick up where we left off last week. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, we saw really these three metaphors where Paul kind of uses kind of things, examples of different kind of occupations, I guess is probably the best way to put it, to show the Christian's commitment. And we talked about last week the dedication of a soldier. This morning we're going to talk about the discipline of an athlete. And next week, the diligence of a farmer. So I think as we think about discipline and even commitment, you think about somebody that is pursuing an athletic endeavor, how would you define each one of those? Discipline and commitment, they're kind of interwoven in my mind pretty much together. How would you describe that for somebody pursuing a very high potential athletic career? What are some of the things that they would do? Train? Train all the time, right? So, right, put off things otherwise you might be doing for fun or for entertainment. You hear people talk about like getting up at 5 a.m. to do it before you go to school or do something like that. Tracy?
It would permeate pretty much every area of their life.
Absolutely.
You said put off, I'd say sacrifice many other things.
Many other things.
Fun or otherwise, not a priority.
Any other thoughts? Some things I was thinking about yesterday, too, and I really went into kind of what we talked about, too, many of the physical things. They adopt very healthy habits, right, to maintain and improve their performance, whether that be practicing and training and things like you have to not just practice your craft, but you also prepare your body. So things like stretching, mobility, things like that is what I'm very lacking right now, as my physical therapist would say. My knee hurts because my hips are too tight. Like, what? Okay, he's right though. He's figured it out. They have to focus on healthy sleeping habits, healthy eating habits. They need to manage the other things of their life. If you're not taking care of your body, their athletic performance will be hindered. But also flipped around, what about more the emotional discipline or emotional commitment? Maria?
I think that, like you said, those two go hand in hand, definitely, but I think they go hand in hand because they kind of fuel each other. You know, as you do more of your training or whatever, your commitment is strengthened, your discipline is strengthened and increased, and then therefore your commitment gets stronger, and it's just, they just work together. And I think the same could be said for the opposite direction too, that if you don't maintain that discipline and you get weaker, then you start to lose the commitment part.
Absolutely. The amount of willpower it takes, right? That emotional commitment. The amount of things that, you have to make choices. I'm going to choose to practice my sport instead of going to the movies and hanging out with my friends. Think about game time, right? They get into very high stress, high tension things. They need to be able to manage their emotions. That doesn't just happen by I show up at the game and away I go. You have to practice and manage your emotions. The ability to control their emotions and focus on the task at hand is what makes great athletes great. Well, how would we then look at that in a more spiritual context? The amount of commitment that an athlete needs both in mental fortitude, willpower, but also the physical changes and physical choices that they make. How would we kind of convert that and look at it in a more spiritual way? What does that look like in our lives today? And what are the things that we must do to truly be committed like an athlete or disciplined like an athlete. The first century was filled with kind of athletic endeavors. I mean, probably all around Timothy in Ephesus. He could see different kind of things and different kinds of athletic endeavors being done. I mean, there's a few of the kind of Greek and Roman athletic endeavors you can kind of see there. There are very many of them. They're also kind of spread out, kind of the first one, they're the Olympic Games. And we see they're honoring one, they're in this athletic endeavor, they are trying to honor a Greek god. Every 4 years, and again, different things. During kind of the 600 to 700 BC, many of these things started and they continued well through the first century. But I think this is kind of how Paul is using, why Paul is using this as kind of a way in. This is something that he uses as an illustration, not only here in 2 Timothy, but throughout some of his other epistles. So go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. That's where we're going to kind of spend a good chunk of our time this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning verse 24. I've got a couple different versions here I'm going to read from. First from the ESV. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives a prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest that after preaching to others, I myself might find myself disqualified. I'm going to read this also from the Young's literal translation. Brings out a couple different things there, kind of right straight from the Greek, and it's very one-to-one translation. Have ye not known that those running in a race, all indeed run, but one receives the prize? So run that ye may obtain. And everyone is striving in all things temperate. These indeed then that the corruptible crown they may receive, but we an incorruptible. I therefore thus run, not as uncertainly, thus I fight, not as beating to the air, but I chastise my body. I bring it into servitude, lest by any means having preached to others, I myself may be disapproved. The first one I really want to pull out today is this idea of being committed to rigorous training. That word temperate, what does that mean? Not something that we use a lot in today's world. But you think of like the temperance movement in the early 1900s. What does the word temperate mean? See?
It's free from extremes. It's level, even, straight, like a climate.
How is that important to both an athlete and us as Christians today? See?
The efforts are steady and constant in one direction, as opposed to waving back and forth and going in various places. So it's steady.
It's that idea of self-control. To me, it seems a little bit a weak word in that way. Self-control, it's self-mastery, or kind of removing those things that can detract us from our aim, our goal. We must control both ourselves and in similar, as we talked about, both in physical ways, but also in emotional ways, like an athlete. We must make the right choices. We must make the right things in our lives that are value added versus those that will detract from our Christian walk. We must control, as we've seen in many cases, control our emotions. In many cases where we see Paul talking to Timothy, he's like, don't get in unnecessary squabbles over just random things. Yeah, you got to preach the word, you got to teach what's right, but keeping our emotions in check. In Galatians chapter 5, you see this is very key to the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians 5:22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. That's the word right there. Against such there is no law. And those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and its desires. We see this idea of temperance, of self-control, of pulling back from maybe what we would like to do to what we should be doing to live pleasing to God and to Christ. We see that as we have, just like Christ, we have crucified the flesh. We've taken those things that our body and our minds kind of like, oh, this is great, this is fun, and pull those things and put them in our own control, our mastery of ourselves, this temperate attitude that we can then go and serve Christ instead. Turn over to 2 Peter chapter 1. We see the same kind of idea, this growth of how this works in our lives. 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse 5, we see this idea of kind of making our calling and our election, confirming it is what kind of the header on my Bible has. Beginning of verse 5, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue. With virtue, and virtue with knowledge. And knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness. And steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love. For these qualities are yours and are increasing to keep you from being ineffective or unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. You see this growth, right? Faith, right? Our belief, our understanding. Virtue, what does virtue mean? It's another word that we don't really use a lot. Maybe Emily can answer this for us. The Greek word is arte. Right? This feeling of moral goodness. Not just belief, but you start to put it into practice. And building upon those practices, our belief, continuing to supplement with knowledge, digging into God's word, and building our strong, and then the outcroppings of that then become self-control, steadfastness, godliness. Those things that we need to strive and strain towards, just like an athlete in their practicing. They don't just go for the Olympic or world record day one. They start small. Many times as small children, they start with this, not even doing the whole thing. I can remember going in like 3rd, 4th grade, we had these like basketball camps in the summer. And you don't start just shooting the ball. First you start with just dribbling. And you start to master that, then you start, we'll start passing it back and forth. You get really advanced, you do a bounce pass. And finally, we start to we shoot. And at the end, you're finally like, okay, now we're playing a game. You just didn't jump right into just running, playing a game, because if you put unskilled kids out there just trying to play basketball, it's just going to be chaos. So much like this, we need to start and build, like we talked about a few weeks ago, the foundational things. Building our faith. Employing that in putting that to practice in our minds and in our hearts, building our knowledge up, that we can then have self-control, steadfastness, and godliness. And the outcroppings of that is greatness. It talks about brotherly love. And that's what knits us all together. And Peter says, this is what it takes, right? He says, if you have these qualities, if you have these things, you are growing, you are adding to yourself, you are pushing towards the goal. You are pushing to avoid being ineffective, avoid being unfruitful. As we think about this, it starts with that dedication. It starts with the discipline to say, yes, this is what I want to pursue. The next thing there we can see back in 2 Corinthians there. Paul talks about that in verse 27. The New American Standard calls it, "But I discipline my body and make it my slave." ESV says, "I keep it under control." I think that notion of not just control, but you think of a slave, right? A slave has to obey its master. Discipline, in this case, in Paul's writing, the discipline there, he says, what I do to discipline my body is translated from a word, it says, giving yourself a black eye. To bring oneself into subjection to your own will. Not just letting your body do what it desires, but pulling in the reins of yourself. Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount contrasted this in Matthew chapter 5, verses 29 to 30. Like you have heard it said, but I say to you. He talks about things like if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. For it's better to go in and lose a member of our body than lose our own soul. Those are some pretty extreme ideas. But I think we understand the concept behind those extreme ideas. Pulling in and reining in our own body is not something that's easy or something that we can just do once in a while. We have to practice at doing that. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20 says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So why do you think Paul is talking about this so much, this disciplining our body? What does that do? What does that look like? Well, how does that happen? Becky?
I can't speak to a lot of this from like a physical exercise kind of thing, because that's not my thing. I'm like the not temperate person. He'll like try and run twice and then quit for 6 months. But I was just thinking about how we can understand that we have to have our body in good shape and our mind in a good place to be able to compete at a high level in athletics or whatever.
that's very good. Yeah, the whole just try harder. Everyone is different, right? We all have different strengths, and we want to excel in our strengths. But guess what? We also have different weaknesses. I think we oftentimes maybe hide behind, oh, I got this great strength and I can put it out there for the world to see. And maybe we hide our weaknesses when maybe showing some of those may help us. I think if you look at a lot of the different things that Paul talks about how to be a good church family, talks about being knit together by what every joint supplies. How did you have different talents? One is an eye, one is a hand, and everybody does something a little differently. But I think, thank you for that comment. The third thing in this is we've seen this a few times in our reading, 1 Timothy chapter 4. Picking up in verse 7, it says, rather train yourself for godliness, for while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, holding the promise for the present life as it comes for the life to come. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance. To this end we toil and strive because we have our hope set on the living God, who is the Savior of all people, especially of those who believe. Paul tells Timothy, we need to exercise. We need to continue to challenge ourselves towards godliness. Paul in verse 26 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9 talks about running with an aim. He talks to Timothy often. He needs to work on the important things and not get bogged down with those things that lose sight of the end goal of godliness. Godliness is really this devotion, this commitment, this disciplined look of how we should live our lives. And it doesn't take, it's not instantaneous. It takes time. It's something that we cannot just turn on the switch. As soon as we're raised up from baptism, we're like, I've got it all figured out. Hebrews chapter 5. Turn over there really quickly. Hebrews chapter 5, starting in verse 12. In this case, for this time you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you again. Journey of maturity. He's like, you should have already been here, but since you're not, what you need to do. The basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk and not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness since he is a child. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have powers of discernment trained by constant practice, to distinguish good from evil. So therefore, let us leave the elementary principles of Christ and press on to maturity. The challenge is, hey, you're still not where you need to be. The challenge isn't this, okay, just stay put. We need to work on progressing. You need to press on towards maturity. You need to move forward by exercising and moving towards godliness. What are some of the things in our lives that really kind of illustrate this ability to do training? This notion of putting ourselves into self-control and disciplining our own self and exercising and pushing towards maturity. What does that look like in our lives today? Maria?
Maybe having us, getting in the habit of regularly studying your Bible, like maybe setting aside
Individual study is one, absolutely. What are some other things?
One part of physical exercise is getting out of your comfort zones. You know, pushing yourself a little bit, go for it on the max, go for a PR, something like that. So in our spiritual life, that would be talk to people. You know, get out of your comfort zone. It's, a lot of us don't like to do that.
Sure.
So talk to strangers.
And I think in doing so, I think you oftentimes learn more yourself than what you're conveying on. Steve?
In a physical realm, there are things you can do, there are ways that you can structure your day or whatever to enhance just what you normally do, right? Taking extra walks, doing extra stairs, whatever, you know, to make sure you're staying physically active. There are some folks in certain professions who don't need to go to the gym, right? Because they get it in their daily, their work and things like that. So spiritually, you know, do things that are more rigorous, that are more focused. What standing, you know, I have a desk at work that I can put standing or sitting, right? You just standing, they say, is good for helping you maintain the physical balance, right? So spiritually, stand, don't lie down. I guess, well, I'll let each of us try to figure out what exactly that analogy plays to, but maintaining that constant lower level effort is also really helpful.
Like, this is tough because this is all encompassing, right? It's like every area of our life spiritually. But like something that I struggle with is just getting out of my own schedule, you know, my own head and thinking of others. And, you know, a lot of these verses talk about brotherly affection and growing toward loving each other. And, you know, so it's just, you know, thinking of others and taking time to reflect on what others need instead of your own busy schedule that you have. And that's something that I struggle with. But
Yeah, I think Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 is key there. It's living as our lives are for Christ, not our own being, our own thoughts, our own desires. I think the other thing is thinking too, it doesn't have to be these massive steps or massive changes in our lives. Making small steps forward to challenge ourselves. I think that's what sometimes we look at, I can never do that. Because this is the huge, big leap from where I am today. But what am I doing to make small, progressive steps towards that goal? So we look at the next kind of grouping here I have is talking about competing by the rules. To compete in Greek games, first of all, you had to train for well over a year. You had to prove you were eligible. You must have the right lineage or the right thing. You must be a citizen. You must have properly trained and must have proper preparation before you don't just get to show up at the Olympic Games and just I'm here, I'm ready to go. I'm signed up for the 400 meters. Check me off. I can run 400 meters. Even today, right, there are qualification events. You have to go through certain rigorous training to even be able to go to something that will allow you to qualify to think about going to Olympic Games. There are minimum time thresholds that you must achieve before you can get there. Luke chapter 14, Jesus talks about how we need to be committed in our own lives. Luke 14, 26 and 27. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned to them and said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, wait a second. That doesn't make sense. Aren't we supposed to love everyone? And yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Jesus outlines that we must be committed to him. This isn't something that we can be kind of wishy-washy on. Not holding our father and our mother and our wife and our children above our commitment to Christ. Otherwise, he says we can't be his disciple. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 5 talks about how we need to make sure that we compete according to the rules. As an athlete is not crowned unless he competes by the rules. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 9:27. He talks about even his own life, right? He needs to continue to have that self-control, lest that even if he's been preaching, he might find himself disqualified. He might find himself out of bounds. It's something that we need to continue to look and see and challenge our own thoughts and challenge our own mindsets. Jesus talks about this on the Sermon on the Mount. Very challenging words. Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 21 says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?' And then will I declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" That's some pretty challenging thoughts, that we must examine ourselves and figure out which group are we in. Are we in the group that is serving God with our lips, but not with our hearts? Talks about people that had prophesied, that do these many wonderful things, but Jesus says, you weren't committed. You weren't with me. You're not there. And because you were not committed in your life to me, I'm not going to cover your faults. Those are pretty challenging thoughts that we need to make sure as we need to examine ourselves. Chad?
Yes, compete by the rules makes me think about, in any sport, it seems like, as I can recall, anytime you violate the rules, it's an advantage to the other team, right? It's runs in baseball, it's shots due to fouls in basketball, it's less players on the ice for hockey. You can go on and on. Anytime there's rule violations, the other team gets the benefit. And I think it's similar here, right? So when we violate, there's two teams. And you're either on the good team or the evil team. It's who benefits.
Thanks.
Yep. I was thinking too with this, it's striking in these athletes' stories how often he says like, you don't want to figure out at the very end that you didn't make it, or that you ran and you didn't receive it. And if you think about that, that's the worst possible outcome. You put in the time and you paid the price and then you didn't receive the reward. And that to me is why I think we see so many encouragements for endurance, that we don't get to the starting line and train only to eventually taper off or try to take a shortcut around the rules. And I think part of our job is to carry one another through those rough stretches, like you have to sometimes in physical training, and lean on someone else to make sure that once we started, we get to the finish line.
Absolutely. Stacy?
And I guess all professional sports, even after it's over, the athletes have to submit to a drug screening and make sure didn't win as a result of some performance enhancing drug. But likewise, we get through all of our life and we've checked all the boxes, but it wasn't in our heart. What good was it? There's a
Absolutely. I think the last point I want to talk about is running to win. I think the last three comments are very much pointed in that direction. So Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1 talks about, since we have been surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, looking back to the chapter 11, it says, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which so clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. These weights, the sin, the baggage that we have, as people train and do things, sometimes you'll put a weight vest on to have more weight and more things, more challenge as you're training. When it comes to race time, you don't put your weight vest on. You take everything off. You run with the lightest shoes, the fastest potential of what you have. We think about our lives and what are those weights and challenges that can drag us down.
I was gonna say, I think it's interesting that he says wait and then he says sin as if they're two different things. I think going along with what Jessica was saying, if our true focus is to serve God with this life, there's a lot of things that we are adding, a lot of weights we add to our life that are not necessary. And so learning to say no to something that maybe isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but it is a weight that's hindering me from serving God to the utmost, I have to do it. And I think I see that more with like my kids, because I'm at an age in my life where I don't care about a lot of things that other people think about me, and I'm good, but they do still care, and they think they have to have all these things in their lives that the world says they have to have, like success and friends and go to all these different activities, and I think you just have to learn to say no. You have to get rid of those weights.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. It's weights and sin. It's those innocent things that maybe in our mind and our lives that can preoccupy us to the point where we don't have room to run that race. Challenge ourselves. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36 through 39 looks at this idea of running with endurance. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrink back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not those who shrink back and are destroyed, but are those who have faith and preserve our souls. We need to run this not short haul of life. We need to run with endurance what is sometimes a long haul in our own lives. It's something that as we think about these encumbrances and challenges and things like that, they're very difficult. And as we finish up here, I want to kind of finish with a couple things here. In chapter 12 and verse 1, we looked at how about removing those distractions. In verse 2, it says, looking to Jesus, the author, the founder, the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. As we remove distractions from our lives, we run with endurance. We need to run with the aim and the fixed eyes on Jesus. Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 9, 24, and 26. This isn't such a way you're uncertain of where you're running. You have a path. There's a course laid out. You don't box just in the air aimlessly, but you box with a purpose. Exercising ourselves and being disciplined like an athlete needs that rigorous training in our lives. Those things that put our own body and our own mind under our own control. Moving step by step and training ourselves towards godliness. looking at how God has laid it out, making sure that we are progressing towards Him, that we find ourselves pleasing in His sight, not just pleasing in the world's sight. And I think this idea of endurance and running to win, the distractions that can get in our way are great. The distractions that can take us off the pathway are many. Let's finish up this morning with Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is in your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. We've kind of talked about today, putting that goal in our mindset of seeking after Him, not the things that are here on earth, an unhinging, an unencumbered look of our lives. Is there any thoughts as we finish up here this morning? Thank you very much.